Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are joined today by Brian Berletic, former U.S. Marine, and who's been since working as an analyst and journalist with his own podcast, which I would definitely recommend. So, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So we see that Trump won the presidency by promising to end the wars and restore the economic power of America, all presented under the banner of America First. We even had Marco Rubio give I would consider the reassuring speech that they do recognize the multipolar realities and America would have to adjust to this. However, we also see that since taking power, the attack on Iran is argued to be actually America First. Allies must prepare for war with China. We learned from Financial Times, which is also part of America First. And now Trump has announced the US will continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. However, this is also now argued to be America First. So it does appear that Trump decides what America First is, and now it appears to be constant war everywhere. And I guess, my first question would be, is how are you interpreting this? Is this aggressive diplomacy putting pressure on Putin? Is it countering criticism at home because he's often accused of being soft on Russia? Or is this just a continuation of what he was always going to do?
Yes, it's absolutely continuity of agenda, and it's continuity of agenda rebranded and sold to the public as "Make America Great Again" or America First. And I tried to warn about this months before the 2024 elections, and there were headlines where then Vice President nominee J.D. Vance said, "We cannot send weapons to Ukraine because we need to send them to go provoke a wider conflict with China." And then when people asked, what do we do about Ukraine? He essentially said, we will freeze the conflict. He didn't say they were going to end it. They talked about a demilitarized zone and essentially freezing it, which is exactly what the US did in Syria. And we saw how that ended up. So the goal was never to end any of these conflicts. Of course, the American people always want to see these conflicts ended. That is who they always vote for in these elections. They're always given promises by whoever it is, whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama, that they're going, or even remember George Bush Jr. said no more global policemen. This has been going on throughout the entire 21st century and most of the 20th century. They tell you what you want to hear, but not really. If you listen carefully, like J.D. Vance was laying out before the elections, even they always intended to keep these wars going. They always planned on shifting responsibility from the U.S. primarily to Europe to kind of just keep the conflict going so that the U.S. can pivot elsewhere. This is called division of labor and strategic sequencing. And I was pointing out Project 2025. This is under the Heritage Foundation, funded by the arms industry, other large corporations. There's the Marathon Initiative, and there's the America First Policy Institute. And these were all connected to President Trump. Many of these people were from his first administration. And each one of these policy think tanks and the papers they were producing laid all of this out in explicit details. They talked about ramping up funding for NATO, getting Europe to pay more for NATO so the U.S. could pivot toward China. The Marathon Initiative actually had a paper titled Strategic Sequencing, where they said there needs to be this division of labor so that the U.S. doesn't have to fight all of these wars by itself at one time. And then once coming into office, in February, so right at the very beginning, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth told Europe, you are going to spend 5% on NATO, on military matters. You're going to double down on Ukraine. You're going to get your troops ready to go into Ukraine if necessary, if the opportunity presents itself. You're going to spend more, and we need to pivot to China. So that was the division of labor and strategic sequencing laid out explicitly, word for word, verbatim in these policy papers, then being put into practice. And so any of this about America First, ending the endless wars, this was just what politicians always do. They tell people what they want to hear to get their supports. And then, of course, they just continue with the agenda as usual. This is exactly what Barack Obama did as well to Democrat voters who voted him into office to stop the wars.
Yeah, I remember when we spoke of division of labor in the 90s, I often think about, Madeleine Albright and her 3Ds, that the Europeans should, well, more or less, the Europeans can do some of the peacekeeping. So the US would, well, make dinner and the Europeans could clean up effectively. So the US had the firing power while the Europeans could do some of this peacekeeping afterwards. But of course, in these days, when multipolar realities can't be denied, I guess the new objective is to change the division of labor, to get the Europeans to carry more of the weight within Europe to counter Russia. But this is very different from ending the conflict with Russia. But on that, wouldn't a 5% increase in spending for the Europeans be also a way of dumping the Ukraine mess on the Europeans and also allow America to leave, or also allow Trump to continue to play the role of the mediator?
Well, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what is this war in Ukraine? Is it some sort of misunderstanding between Ukraine and Russia? No. Is it even a misunderstanding between Europe and Russia? Absolutely not. It's not even a misunderstanding between the US and Russia. It was a very deliberately engineered proxy war waged against Russia as part of this very long since the end of the Cold War, this idea that no peer or near peer competitor can be allowed to rise. That includes Russia in Europe, Iran in the Middle East, and China in the Asia Pacific region. They're going to encircle and contain these countries. They're going to destabilize nations along their borders, along their periphery. They're going to transform them into battering rams to use against these nations themselves. So that was always the intention. That is why this war is being waged against, or as a U.S. war being waged against Russia through Ukraine. There are U.S. generals, as the New York Times reported, at the very top of the chain of command, ordering Ukrainian troops. And of course, the Western media also revealed that from 2014 onward, the U.S., the Central Intelligence Agency, controls the civilian and military intelligence agencies of Ukraine. So when we see the SBU or whoever it is claiming to carry out these assassinations in Russia of journalists, of generals, of politicians, that is the CIA doing that. They're overseeing this. They created these units, they trained them, and they enable absolutely all of this. And so it is a U.S. war against Russia through Ukraine. They want Europe to ramp up, take public money away from the actual European public and channel it into this to free up more resources for the U.S. to pivot elsewhere. They need to dismember Iran in the Middle East to further isolate both Russia and China, and ultimately they need to begin encircling and containing China. It is rising rapidly, and there will be a point of no return where it irreversibly surpasses the West, and there's nothing the U.S. can do to change that. And so they're racing against the clock, and this is why they're doing it. And people would ask, because this is a point people make to me all the time, why on earth would Europe ever agree to this? Why would they take 5% of their GDP and spend it on a U.S. proxy war? It's basically national suicide. But isn't that what we're watching Ukraine commit in front of the entire planet? They're committing national suicide. Why is that? Because the U.S. politically captured them in 2014. They installed a client regime into power that serves Washington's interests at the expense of Ukraine's. And the European Union acts as a bureaucratic blanket that has been thrown over the continent of Europe to smother individual sovereignty of each individual nation state. And that bureaucracy answers to and works for Washington at the expense of Europe. And we could already see the consequence and very negative consequences of this. And there's no reason why these bureaucrats are ever going to say, wait, this isn't for the best interest of Europe. They don't work for Europe. They work for Washington. So this is the problem. And this is why, yes, in a way, it's the U.S. dumping it on Europe, but it's still an American proxy war being waged. I guess there's no reason for Europe. There's no interest being served in Europe to wage this war or to have any sort of conflict with Russia at all in the first place. So it really is still an exercise of U.S. primacy over Europe and their attempt to extend that primacy over Russia.
Yeah, the capturing of Europe is something that well, still amazes me though. The Ukrainian one was kind of obvious over the past 10 years. If you paid attention, that is, as you said, in 2014, capturing then the political class that's choosing who should be in government, who should stay out, and also pushing people up or down based on the extent to which they do as they're told. We learned that from day one after the coup, the US also began to capture the intelligence agencies in Ukraine as a source of power, rebuilding them from scratch because they were considered to be too friendly to Russia. We saw them capturing the finance, business, the military, and even civil society with all these NGOs and USAID. So it's kind of been obvious how the country has been under US administration, something that the general prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, also complained about, that the Americans would decide, effectively every government official who should be in and who should be out. But the Europeans is it's more perplexing to me. I mean, I've had interviews with people like Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who argued that in the early 2000s they had whiteboards in the White House where they were listing all the European politicians, who they should elevate, who they should push down, according to who would do America's bidding. But still, everyone knew that this war would come, that we were going down this path. Everyone knew it would be devastating for Europe. Again, Ukraine being destroyed, Europe becoming insignificant, it's still surprising to me that there's not even a political opposition anymore. Media, political class, everyone is on board with this, even as the Americans are pulling away. But do you see the Europeans not understanding that when they're spending 5%? Because I think the Europeans would like to buy America's affection again, that is, for America not to leave. But by spending this 5%, it's enabling America to leave, isn't it? That's their exit ticket to leave the continent.
Well, people do make this point that Europe does not want the U.S. to leave, but who in Europe doesn't want the U.S. to leave? The client regime the U.S. installed into power, they don't want it to leave. Nobody else would be missing out on anything if the U.S. left. Just think back to before 2014, before the U.S. overthrew the government of Ukraine. What was going on between Europe and Russia at the time? A very constructive and growing relationship. There was the Nord Stream pipelines. They were already in operation. Nord Stream 2 was coming online, and they were getting cheap hydrocarbons from Russia. There was peace and stability. This was also opening the way for closer cooperation with the rest of Eurasia, especially China. The Belt and Road Initiative was reaching its way towards Europe. And of course, the United States found this unacceptable. And this is part of the reason why they ignited this conflict in Ukraine, not just to encircle and contain Russia and to push back China, but also to reassert. If you are familiar with everything that happened all throughout the Cold War, this was a very long process of working America's way into Europe's institutions, capturing them, pushing out people who sought to preserve European sovereignty. Is a long, complex process. But at this point, maybe 20, 30 years ago, this would not have been possible. But today, it is possible. They have finally reached the point where they have the vector sum of control over the political processes in Europe is for Washington at the expense of Europe itself. So that is why they're doing this. There's no reason for Europeans themselves to fight to keep the U.S. there for what? To protect them from Russia, which was never a threat to them in the first place, to protect them from cheap hydrocarbons and greater trade and cooperation with a rising economic giant like China. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. But in terms of preserving American primacy both over Europe and an attempted reassertion of control over the planet, yes, that makes perfect sense.
Well, I very much agree with you, though, that Trump, that his so-called peace presidency has been misunderstood, because if you do go through his rhetoric, not just during the election campaign, but all the way back to the 1980s, what he was always complaining about was America being used as a sucker. So the core of his message appeared to be that the American empire was not sustainable because its allies and they drained America of its competitiveness and resources. So more or less the argument was they should pay us to keep them safe. So make the empire sustainable. And it appears that this is a lot of the policies it had, from pulling out of NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It just was seen as being unsustainable, transferring too much productive capacity and power from America to its proxy. So it should be the other way around. And so, in other words, make a higher return on investment on the empire to make it more sustainable. And even the rhetoric towards his allies is not, we have to move beyond the alliance system and pursue a different path to security. Instead, it seems his argument is you have to do as you're told, otherwise, the hammer will drop. But yeah, this is a recipe for sustainability of empire, not scaling back the empire. But with that thought in mind, how do we explain the early rhetoric of the Trump administration? Because immediately after it took power, you had people like Pete Hegseth telling the Europeans as well as the Russians, we want for Ukraine, the solution has to be, more or less three legs. It has to be neutrality for Ukraine, so no more NATO expansionism. There has to be territorial concessions, and there will be no American security guarantees in terms of bringing American troops into this if the peace will be broken. But now, suddenly, we're talking about a ceasefire in which it's very obvious that this is meant to create a long war for continue to pump in weapons into Ukraine, more or less making it still a de facto NATO member. Was that deception in the beginning, or how do we explain this massive pivot? Because this is very different from the initial rhetoric.
It absolutely was 100% deception. It was the exact same deception the U.S. used vis-a-vis Iran, pretending to negotiate with them, while all along for months, maybe a year or more, they had been planning this attack, this sneak attack on Iran, a decapitation strike to remove the government and topple the political establishment in Iran. And so it was just deception. They desperately needed Russia to agree to some sort of ceasefire, to put a pause on the conflict in Ukraine. They were never going to resolve the central issue. And we have to remember, President Trump and people in his administration many months ago all admitted that this was a U.S. proxy war against Russia. And now to listen to President Trump upset and frustrated that Russian President Vladimir Putin refuses to just roll over and allow this proxy war to continue or to be frozen and held in place while the U.S. attacks Russian allies in Iran and in China and then circles back to this, to be upset about that shows you just how disingenuous and how deceptive this all was from the very beginning. It was absolute deception. It was the same talk that we heard ahead of the Minsk agreements, pretending that we were looking for some sort of solution to these conflicts, when in fact we were just buying time to a later date where things leaned in our advantage and we could finally succeed where we had been failing previously. They did the exact same thing with Syria too. They constantly talked about a political settlement in Syria, but the only settlement they had in mind was regime change and installing literal Al-Qaeda as the head client regime running Damascus, which now has taken place. And by the way, just another example of continuity of agenda, that was something that began all the way back under Bush Jr. They began training and preparing extremists linked to Al-Qaeda to overthrow nations like Syria and Libya. The so-called Arab Spring sprung under the Obama administration and continued under 4 years of Trump. And then the Syrian conflict was concluded under the Biden administration. They overthrew it. They installed these terrorists that all the way back in Bush Jr.'s time they were preparing, and now President Trump is delisting Al-Qaeda affiliate because now they need to more openly back them, arm them, and prepare Syria as a springboard against Iran and its allies across the region. So this is how it all works. It is all continuity of agenda, and this rhetoric that we hear is to try to just convince us otherwise, to distract us away from this, and to divide people, get them fighting against each other between Republican and Democrat, when everyone should get together and oppose the entire political system.
Yeah, even now, they're talking a possible peace with Iran. You see the restoration of diplomatic ties with the ISIS-led Syria, which also, I assume, will entail arms supply. So from where I'm sitting, it looks as if they're preparing regional proxies for another go at Iran. But I think what the surprise attack on Iran was a wake-up call to Moscow as well, because many people, well, to use your word, really wanted to believe that they had a president they could work with in Washington to effectively resolve some of the underlying problems we had in Europe since the end of the Cold War. That is the failure to establish a mutually acceptable post-Cold War security architecture. But the reference you had, Trump, he has to explain why they're now going to embrace the Biden policies of sending more weapons to Ukraine. He listed the way he blamed Putin. He said he's very nasty. He talks nice, he's kind, but then in the evening he goes on bombing. And it's a nice emotional appeal, but it didn't address the core problem. If there is no peace deal pending, and no one pretends that there is, why would they still expect Russia to scale back and wait? Is it Trump's kind words, or is there there's so much chatter and catchphrases, you kind of don't get the heart of the problem here. What did they expect? What do they expect Russia to do by continue the war if there's no peace on the table? They weren't going to walk away from Ukraine. Is there any explanation from the administration?
Well, again, this just goes to show how dishonest President Trump was from the absolute very beginning. There is a root cause to this conflict, and he himself and people in his administration pointed it out. It is a U.S. proxy war being fought against Russia. So if that is true, then absolutely every part of this process is completely wrong. He should have, if he had genuine intentions of resolving this, he has to address that aspect, because that is the root cause. The root cause that Russia itself constantly refers to in all of these ongoing negotiations. They constantly say, if you're not going to address the root cause, which is that this is a U.S. proxy war against us, it's not a war between us and Ukraine. It is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia being fought through Ukraine. If you're not going to resolve that, then you're not actually trying to resolve anything. You're just trying to buy time like you did in Syria. You're trying to lower our guard like you did with Iran. And so there, just as you say, there's no reason for Russia to accept anything. Why would they accept a ceasefire? All that would do is repeat the same cycle of deception, regrouping, rearming that the U.S. has used through the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, and now with these negotiations. So they were not going to fall for it. Again, if President Trump really wanted to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, he would say there are U.S. generals running this war in Germany. They're at the top of the chain of command. They're coming home. The CIA is pulling up and out of Ukraine. They have no right to be there. How are they serving our interests as America first, MAGA? How is this benefiting us, having the CIA deeply embedded in Ukraine? We're going to end all arms to Ukraine. And if you don't want Ukraine to just completely collapse, but those are the things the U.S. has to do to address the root cause, which is that this is a U.S. proxy war in the first place. And he suggested none of these things. So it was all, again, just a ruse to get Russia, and there were all kinds of public and private carrots and sticks offered to Russia to get that ceasefire. And you could almost feel, it's almost palpable, the anger and frustration the U.S. establishment, the unelected special interests that are handing President Trump and everyone else their policies. You could see how angry and frustrated they are that Russia did not agree. And now the U.S. is going to have to continue this war, as well as continue their attempt to overthrow the Iranian government and try to contain China. So strategic sequencing is meant to prevent the U.S. having to fight 3 wars at once, Russia, Iran, and China are not allowing the U.S. to do that, nor should they. It's a matter of self-preservation for these nations and every nation in between, the entire multipolar world, essentially.
I'm glad you brought that up because again, the main targets of the United States now is, as you said, Russia, China, and Iran. Even doing some military planning now or exercises against China. And as you said before, they don't seem to be done with Iran yet, irrespective of what they said. And the war continues against Russia. So do you see any coordination between these three countries? Because, well, surely they do understand they're all being targeted, but what exactly can they do in terms of aligning policies?
It's a very good question. We only know different pieces of this puzzle. Just to point one thing out, though, that should be very clear. In Project 2025, the Marathon Initiative, the America First Policy Institute, they all identified Russia, China, Iran, also North Korea as primary threats to the United States. And when they say to the United States, they mean American primacy abroad. They don't threaten the U.S. within its own borders. And so that, if you're identifying these nations as adversaries, of course your foreign policy will be adversarial, even if you're pretending that you want reconciliation with these nations. So it's important to point that out. We already see Russia, Iran, China, North Korea working together in many different ways. China, of course, uses its economic might to support the economies of Iran, of Russia, to create an alternative for the collective West trying to cut off these nations, isolate them economically. With China's rise, this becomes more and more difficult, if not impossible. North Korea has used its military-industrial base to help supply Russia with additional artillery shells. There's talk that they provided rockets and missiles, and now they admit that even a number of North Korean troops have participated in special military operation, albeit inside Russian territory, to push Ukrainians out of Kursk. And so and of course, Russia and China, and I think also North Korea, over many years has helped Iran build up its ballistic missile arsenal that it has used to deter or to defend itself against U.S.-backed regime change, whether it's the U.S. or Israel or both attacking them. And so this is going to continue. I think they will continue to expand it. I think there's a lot of things going on that we don't really see. These nations do not want to create a mirror reflection of NATO. They are trying to build a multipolar world order. They do not want to replace U.S. hegemony with Chinese, Russian, or some other type of hegemony. They want a truly multipolar world where there's a balance of global power. And so that is being taken into consideration as they coordinate their responses. And only time is going to tell. And details will emerge as all of these conflicts continue.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting in the Munich Security Summit, you had Keith Kellogg telling the Europeans that we have to change course on Russia. And the reason he gave was what you suggested. This was deeply problematic that, well, before the war, at least before the Russians invaded in 22, there hadn't been that close security cooperation between the Chinese and North Koreans, the Russians and North Koreans, or the Russians and the Chinese. But now this was intensifying and this was problematic, which is, well, why it was necessary to work towards reducing this. And it's assumed that, if you stop the war against Russia, then these relationships won't be that tight. But in reality, they didn't stop the conflict or the war against Russia. They just, try to push them apart while still continuing these wars. But this is what appears to be failing. But it did make me think about the normalization, though, because as they're dealing with Ukraine, they try to split it from the bilateral, with the normalization of bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. Do you see this as being, fitting within the wider objective? That is, U.S. can still work with Russia, but the Europeans deal with, do the confrontation against the Russians, and the Americans can try to pull them a bit away from China and North Korea? Or because if that is the case, it would appear to me that the Russians would, well, ideally they would want an end to the Ukraine war as well. But if they can normalize relations with the US on other issues, then this will be favorable. But surely they are aware that the overarching objective is to pry them away from other centers of power.
Exactly. So if Moscow is well aware of America's strategic sequencing, the idea that, yes, we need to pretend to be friends with Russia now so that we could defeat in detail Iran and China and then isolate Russia and defeat them later. If Russia is aware of this, why, for what purpose would they ever have going along with this? But one thing I will say, the reason they do continue the conflict in Ukraine, because is not necessarily about, people keep saying, well, Russia has defeated the US in Ukraine. Well, the war is still going on. Russia is heavily invested. In fact, to the extent where Russia is overextended. And this was the whole point. There's literally a paper titled Extending Russia by the Rand Corporation in 2019. And it talks about all of these ways you could mire Russia in all of these different conflicts along its periphery. Specifically, they mentioned Ukraine and also Syria. And by tying Russia up in Ukraine from 2022 onward, Russia's commitment to Syria was weakened. It was undermined. And this is what allowed the US to topple Syria ultimately. And so they are forcing Russia to make very difficult decisions. They are doing the exact same thing to Iran and also China. That is their strategy. And I'm sure that everyone, whether it's Moscow, Tehran, or Beijing, I'm sure that they all understand this. And I don't think that they're ever going to fall for any notion of being accepted by the West. At this point, I don't think anyone could be naive or foolish enough to believe that they have a seat at that table. That is not how it works. That's not how it has ever worked. And the only time they offer a seat there is if they're trying to trick you, to lower your guard, or to convince you into a self-destructive policy like agreeing to a ceasefire so the U.S. can aim its resources elsewhere and then come back when you'll be isolated and weaker than ever.
But if Russia continues on the current path, well, not accepting any ceasefire, it does appear that the American strategy has some limitations to it, because now Trump, well, effectively say we're going to continue supplying all these Patriots. Well, the Europeans will send them, and we will sell ours to the Europeans, which fits nicely under this strategy of, I guess, return on investments of empire, because the Americans are sending weapons. But the key distinction from the Biden administration is that the entire financial cost is now ending up with the Europeans. That is, Europeans buy American weaponry and they send it to Ukraine. But there's limits to what America can send in terms of weapons, and there's also limits to the financial strength of Europe. Things are not going well here at all. Well, they're all now facing more and more economic problems, which is also translating into even more lack of political legitimacy. And I think this is one of the key crises we're going to have in Europe in the years to come. That is, the political class in more and more European countries are not seen as having proper legitimacy anymore. So how long can the political West continue this proxy war before something cracks? Because even if Trump now sends all the weapons he's talking about, Russia's not gonna bow to any pressure if it doesn't get the peace agreement it demands, which is what Hegseth laid out a few months ago. So how long can this actually continue, or how significant is the America or Trump deciding that this is his war after all? What is the significance?
Well, I mean, the significance is all of this is continuing as it has been going all throughout the 21st century. And you're absolutely right. The United States has strengths. It also has weaknesses. Its military industrial base is one of those, a very big weakness, and it has been exposed by this conflict in Ukraine. But we have to remember that the objective for the U.S. is to keep Russia tied up in Ukraine. So this war, as it's going right now, could continue for several more years even. We don't know where the cracking point is. A lot of people, when they see Russia making advances and they see the Ukrainian military gradually deteriorating, they're tempted to make predictions about when it's all going to collapse, but it hasn't collapsed yet. And then even if it does collapse, we can see the U.S. plan is to send European troops into whatever is left of Ukraine and create a buffer zone and to force a freeze of the conflict. Now, Russia says that they will attack these troops, and this is a standoff that is now taking place. We don't know how it's going to unfold, but that is what they are preparing for. They are openly preparing to do this. This coalition of the willing, that has manifested itself over the last couple of months. This was part of Secretary Hegseth's directive back in February. He told European and non-European troops they are going to go into Ukraine as part of a peace deal. But when he said peace deal, he meant freezing it, a Syria-style buffer zone. And so if the goal is to just keep the war going, this trickle of weapons and support is good enough. They have no I don't think they have any serious ambitions of winning this conflict. They have to continue to say that to keep Ukrainians fighting and to keep the general public on board with this. They need to maintain that illusion. They're not going to admit that the plan all along was to fight to the last Ukrainian. And by the way, in the Rand Corporation paper from 2019, they even said that if we provoke a war with Russia in Ukraine, it's almost certainly going to lead to everything that we see taking place now. Huge numbers of casualties, the loss of territory, and a disadvantageous settlement once everything runs out and collapses. And that's what we're watching. And the goal now is not to change the course of the conflict. It's to just keep this going for as long as possible while the U.S. pivots and attempts to dismantle Iran and also continues to try to provoke and confront China right off its own shores. And then, if we study history, how many examples of empire overextending itself and failing can we pick from to predict where this is all headed? Just because it's destined for failure doesn't mean they're not going to fully commit to trying anyway. I think that's what we see happening. And of course, I always remind people not to become complacent. Multipolarism is not a done deal. It's going to take commitments and hard work and sacrifice by everyone everywhere to make this happen. The U.S. is a vast global empire today in this modern age. It seeks to preserve its power, and it's not going to go without a fight. And it will only stop, and it will only be contained and change course when the rest of the world creates an environment in which it can no longer pursue empire. And so this is where the real battle lines are drawn. It is not drawn between Republican, Democrat, deep state, or MAGA in the United States. That is all, if you want to use the term deep state, that is all just deep state branding to keep everybody going in the same direction. It is actually between the unipolar world order and the multipolar world order. That is where the real battle lines are drawn.
Marco Rubio expressed this concern that in a few years, the question isn't anymore who to sanction. It's that it won't matter anymore. He was referencing China and Brazil, I think it was, who increased their settlements in their own currencies. And effectively, in his words, making America matter less. So, yes, taking away this huge hammer of the United States. But at the same time, surely he recognizes that the actions of the U.S. is what's provoking this. I thought it was interesting because if you compare this to his interview about multipolar realities, it seemed to contradict it. That he recognizes many centers of power, but everyone still has to toe the line and do as they're told by America, which I guess lends credibility to your idea that they're just reshuffling. But my last question is about how you see China reacting to all of these developments, because there were some comments from China that they can't let Russia fail because they know they're next on the chopping block if that happens. And also it appears that China has assisted Iran in replenishing some of its weaponry, or it's unclear. It at least appears that some military flights have been making some drop-offs in Iran. You can also perhaps add, I'm not sure to what extent China's cutting off the United States on access to rare earth minerals it needs in its weaponry, but how is China leaning into this, given that they know after Russia and Iran, China is next? How are they seeking to, well, prevent this development?
Well, not only is China next in that sense, they're already targeted by the US, and they have been for decades and decades. This whole issue over Taiwan, which under international law is recognized as an island province of China, and even by the US State Department is recognized as part of China under the One China policy. This has always just been a battle between the US trying to contain, not just contain China, but strip territory from it, and to divide and destroy China as a functioning nation state. This has been going on for decades. It continues even to this day. The United States, from at least the Obama administration all the way up until now, you still see this in the news. A couple of times a year, US-backed militants in Baluchistan, Pakistan, southwest Pakistan, killed Chinese engineers, and they killed the Pakistani security forces protecting them. They are working on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There are ports, roads, pipelines, railways, power plants. The US is killing Chinese people by proxy there. They have used armed militants in Myanmar to attack Chinese investments and also Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure in Myanmar. That is here in Southeast Asia, just west of Thailand's neighbor to the west. And so between that, US troops being stationed on Taiwan, despite officially recognizing Taiwan as part of China, and this huge military buildup all along China's coast and its periphery, continued political interference here in Southeast Asia, here in Thailand, where I am. The NED, a lot of people think Trump dismantled and defunded the National Endowment for Democracy. That's not true. Their website is still up. They have a new policy of non-disclosure. They're not disclosing their funding anymore. So the veneer of transparency is gone. And they continue to try to pry these nations away from their own best interests, which includes working together with China. So China is already under siege. And this is something I think people have a hard time understanding. They say, why doesn't China do more to help Iran and Russia? Because they themselves are under siege. This idea of division of labor, strategic sequencing, miring these nations in a large number of conflagrations all along their periphery is designed to tie them down while the U.S. defeats each in detail. And so this is what they're constantly fighting back against. But I think what we can agree on is that China has been more outspoken. They're being more assertive as they become stronger, and as the U.S. constrains the number of options they have available to them, they're going to have to fight back more and more openly, because the U.S. is leaving them no choice but to do so, and they're acquiring the power to do it effectively. And so this is the push and pull and the balance of power all of these events are unfolding within. This is what we have to keep an eye on. And I think it's very important for people to just accept that President Trump lied to them deliberately. He never sought any, he has policy papers that people in his administration wrote, that people like Secretary Hegseth are reading from verbatim, that this term, division of labor, peace through strength, all of these slogans are from these policy papers, verbatim, word for word. There was no intention. This was for peace or pivoting away from empire and toward multipolarism. There is not a single policy paper anywhere of any significance that has that as a policy objective. It is continuity of agenda. That is what we're watching. And they use different means to dress it up and distract people away from it, but that is what continues. And I think it's a much more compelling proposition to make now with the things President Trump, his administration have announced regarding Russia, Iran, and China.
And I think it's worth noting as well that as people in the United States who voted for Trump, the MAGA America firsters, begin to recognize that he's not actually pursuing what he was promising or speaking to during the campaign, that it's not just them who's growing impatient and angry, if you will, but it's also other powers around the world, that is Russia, China, Iran, any hope they had that the United States under Trump was someone they could deal with and make a permanent peace settlement to change relations fundamentally, that they're also now shedding these illusions. So I think there's going to be a much tougher pushback against America, not just from within as Trump loses more and more support, but also from these Eurasian powers who are now, this was seen as the last hope they had in a partner in the White House. So it's a dangerous time, because if there's no belief anymore in a political settlement, as you suggested, they will have to start to push back a lot harder. And what the great deal maker in the White House will do when he gets nothing of what he promised, again, appears to be much like his predecessors, military force. So well, Brian, thank you so much for your time, letting me pick your brain, and I'll hope you come back on soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.